Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, one of the biggest news stories of this past year has been the news itself, particularly the distribution of it in a dramatically changing newspaper market. We'll look tonight at a business journal's perspective of John George's experience creating the New Orleans Advocate. Steve Scalise has been making national headlines now that he is installed as Majority Whip. We'll examine power or the lack thereof in the state's congressional delegation. We'll also look at a couple of tough tourism issues before the City Council, as well as new direction at HANO and the conclusion of a series of legacy lawsuits. And joining our legacy are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4; Stephanie Riegel, editor, Baton Rouge Business Report; and JAQUETTA White, reporter, the New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go first over to JAQUETTA, and there are some big tourism issues going before council for council consideration. Tell us about those.
That's right. There are two main issues, and they're related to each other. They're both tourism issues, and one is they're both a part of what's called as the share or the sharing economy. And one is this addition of a ride-sharing service in New Orleans known as Uber, and particularly Uber Black. And the second is short-term rentals and the introduction, the growing use of Airbnbs and VRBOs in New Orleans, these short-term rentals. And so the council has been considering these separately, but most recently this week the Transportation Committee forwarded on to the full council, though without recommendation from the committee, a plan to introduce Uber Black, which is Uber's luxury ride-sharing service in New Orleans. Now the way this works, the way Uber works is you can sort of call up on an app a car, and like a taxi. It's like hailing a taxi on your phone. You can call up a car and know exactly where it is, and it'll presumably show up to pick you up. What's different here in the Uber Black service is that these are only black cars, limousine-style cars, town cars that would be introduced here. The concern, though, is that Uber will do what it's done in some other cities, and that's use Uber Black to sort of shoehorn its low-cost service, UberX, into the market. And UberX is it's operated by regular folks like me and you.
So what is the worry then about UberX? Is it regulation?
There's several things. Regulation is definitely one of them. One of the complaints has been that Uber allows ill-equipped drivers to operate its cars, people who've been arrested for various concerns, and then also that it will pose problems, unfair competitive advantages for the taxi cab industry.
Especially at a time when there's a lot of pressure on the taxi industry to upgrade its performance, and to have better vehicles and to maintain them, and so there's these demands on the taxis, but yet you see Uber coming in.
Exactly, and Councilman Jason Williams has recognized that, and at the Transportation Committee most recently introduced an ordinance that would change what had been set last year as a maximum age limit for cabs. He increased it to 11 years from 8 years, I believe, and he also changed the restriction on the type of credit card machines that taxis can use.
I think the fact, though, is that it's already in places like New York and places, and so once it's in a place like New York and people experience it and they start seeing it, it's going to be kind of hard to reverse that flow.
And people expect it. Yeah.
These on-demand car rental type things where it's a drop-off of a car at a location, you use the app, and then it tells you what location the car is available, and then it's yours for however period of time. That's been in Washington and New York for almost a decade, I think, or something along that lines. And it's like, how does that compete directly with cabs? That's what I don't understand.
So, I mean, that's something that the council is going to be grappling with, too, because this is something, as I've heard in these council hearings, them admit that, the council members admitting that it's here. You know, this is the new age, it's here, it's something that we're going to deal with and have to regulate in some sort of way, and make sure everybody is treated fairly, and that public safety is always, you know, a main concern. One other issue, as we said, is short-term rentals. Explain what that's about.
That's right. And so this is a similar situation where you or I can rent a room in our home or our cottage house without being a licensed B&B. You just advertise it on a website like Airbnb or VRBO, and anyone who wants to stay there can for however long. The problem, of course, is that this raises the ire of B&Bs and other folks who are licensed and regulated in New Orleans. And so that's something the council is also weighing, just how to, if we allow this, allow it with some sort of regulation, or should there continue to be an all-out restriction on it?
So these short-term rentals, I mean, it could happen anywhere, any neighborhood? There's no zoning regulation, no licensing at all.
Where it's happening more plentifully is in places like the French Quarter and in Bywater and Marigny. I mean, it's being used for tourism, and people who live there don't like that because it's places that are empty a lot of times during the year. You know, you don't have that activity. A lot of times these people, when they do come, they have automobiles, and so either they're renting cars, and so it's taking up parking places. But they don't. But they feel like those things take away from the feeling of neighborhood.
Well, I did a story about a year ago with Claire at the Advocate. We teamed up about Archie Jefferson. Being on Airbnb with his place where his wife was murdered in Broadmoor.
With these, I mean, how could the city possibly police that, you know, and keep track of who's doing it? So this is something the city council really just have to grapple with. And they're going to be doing that soon.
That's right. The plan is to write some sort of new comprehensive ordinance that would cover that, but it's coming down much later this year.
Thanks a lot, JAQUETTA. And real quick, I want to ask you, because you are in Baton Rouge, UberX is in Baton Rouge. How's it going?
UberX is in Baton Rouge. It's doing great. I mean, so far. The interesting thing about Uber there was that, in fact, we broke the story that they were looking at the market. Within 3 weeks, the Metro Council in Baton Rouge had passed a ride-sharing ordinance welcoming them to come. One councilman said they felt like they found the unicorn when they came to Baton Rouge, because so many cities like New Orleans are wary of it, and Baton Rouge said, come, because the taxis there are so bad. So far, so good. Only the UberX is in Baton Rouge, not the Black service. They're grappling with some of the regulatory issues too, but this is the sharing economy, as JAQUETTA said, and so it's just a matter of time until the regulatory agencies catch up and rewrite the rules to accommodate the new economy.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Over to Errol right now. Steve Scalise, now number 3 in the House, right? On GOP leadership, anyway.
Yeah, I think he learned on his first day on the job that if he's going to be a whip, he's going to need to get a bullwhip, okay? Because on the very first day, they tried to get the party to vote on the party position on immigration, and the Tea Party people have no part of it, so it fell through, and now they're out on recess, and so he's in office. But you know, having our own member of Congress, depending on where you live in New Orleans, as whip, you know, people have talked about, well, what does this mean for us? You know, what kind of wealth and grandeur does it mean? And of course, the closest case was Hale Boggs many years ago, who was on the verge of becoming Speaker of the House. And the thing is, it's not like it used to be. Politics has changed. Back in Hale Boggs' day, there were 8 members of Congress from Louisiana. Every one of them was powerful, because that was back in the days of the Solid South. And so if you were elected into Congress, you spent your whole career there. Seniority was more important. So all of a sudden, congressmen had a lot of seniority. Everyone controlled a lot of things. And so to have all of those people, and then to have the whip or the majority leader, just meant a lot. It's not the same thing as we saw this week. You know, your first vote that you defeated. I think the reality is something that Scalise was quoted actually in the Advocate as saying when he was asked about what does this mean to Louisiana, and he says, well, it means that you're going to have someone who shares the political philosophy, the conservative philosophy of Louisiana to the nation. And so I guess, if you're interested in the philosophy, it's important. If you're looking for pork barrel, that's not the answer that you're looking for. And so it's really not going to be that much of a pork barrel position as it used to be. But it's, I mean, it's
well, and if you're
prestige.
In the wing of a party that is anti-pork,
right?
And
especially
about budget hawks and about
exactly.
You know, watching the bottom line, then bringing home the bacon is not going to be your thing in a leadership position.
That would be against your philosophy to do it anyway. So,
but when you have a Republican Party that's as divided between the Tea Party far right and the more moderate Republicans, I mean, is Scalise in a good position to be able to corral them and bring them together?
I think he is. Yeah, I think he is, especially being from the South and being from Louisiana. I think he's in a better position, which is what I mean. The fact that he won that office, I think says something about his political finesse.
Yeah, that's what a whip is expected to do, right? To bring parties together and negotiate, and he's been really lauded as being a really good negotiator and really using that Louisiana charm. He's very, very good at doing that.
He's a personable guy. He really is. I think he's got good really political instincts.
Very powerful position right now. Thanks a lot, Errol. And Stephanie, you did a piece in Baton Rouge Report about John George's and taking a look at sort of a year down the line after he decided to get into the newspaper business. What did you find?
Well, we took a look at how the Advocate was doing 1 year, as you say, 15 months or so since George's bought it, and you know, his regional business model. I think a lot of people here focus on the New Orleans Advocate. There's also the Acadiana Advocate, which he launched in the fall, and of course the flagship Baton Rouge Advocate. And you know, I think personally and I think professionally, journalistically, the product is just 100 times better. And the Advocate was always a good, solid, steady paper.
So you're talking New Orleans Advocate as opposed to Advocate.
Well, I'm talking about the Baton Rouge Advocate right now, and also the New Orleans Advocate. But I mean, he's created a wonderful journalistic product, you know, that people from the Poynter Institute, for instance, just really applaud the quality of the writers that they've brought in. They've poured a ton of money into it. Circulation-wise, the numbers are up. Part of that is just a function of the fact that they're in new markets. It's hard to get a handle on exactly where the numbers are, and that's because the most recent circulation data was published in March. Now already we're almost to August, okay? And it was based on the preceding 6 months, and the growth didn't really start until last fall. So George's says by the time the numbers came out, they were already obsolete. They showed tremendous growth in the areas outside Baton Rouge, the core market. We don't know how much of that growth was in New Orleans versus Lafayette, for instance, because the report that came out from the Circulation Bureau doesn't break it out by markets. So after I wrote the story, for instance, and said that the Advocate experienced 30% growth in the New Orleans and Lafayette markets, I got hate mail from the Times-Picayune managing editor up in Baton Rouge who said, well, you didn't blah, 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 blah. Well, it was impossible to know. The point is there has been growth. How much growth, whether as much growth as George's says when he gives speeches around the state, it's not exactly clear. Advertisers are warming to it. The New Orleans Advocate, I mean, y'all see it, you pick it up. It's not as thick as the Baton Rouge version. I think a lot of the advertisers that I spoke to said, we like the product, but it's print. And so advertisers that are moving away from print to begin with, are not embracing it. Those that are still placing ads in print are buying. You know, the demographics skew slightly higher with the New Orleans Advocate. George has said their average reader has an income of between $70,000 and $80,000. Some of the advertisers I spoke to, hospitals for instance, said that's been borne out by their experience. So if they're running an ad about a wellness campaign that targets executives, they'll buy the New Orleans Advocate versus the Times-Picayune.
Yeah, I think like what you call the chronic news person, news viewer, or news audience, okay? The kind of person who'd be watching this program, okay, all right, that person would want the Advocate because they recognize what's happened and they want the changes. I think there's a lot of people who just maintain traditions, and the traditions were that their grandpa got the Times-Picayune and their father did and that, and they're not necessarily reading for the hard news, even though, I mean, the Picayune's still doing a good job with hard news, but it's just a tradition of doing it. And so the Advocate pretty much has to go to that more discriminating news person,
right,
or news consumer.
Did you get a sense of how much things were affected by the fact that there was an introduction to the New Orleans market before George's bought it? Because some people what I've heard is that you had this immediate increase from people who were angry at the Times-Picayune for what they'd done when the Manships still owned the paper, right, and they had a very bare-bones staff here. And then by the time George's got into it, there had been some maybe decrease in circulation from the New Orleans Advocate people, and then when he really branded it as New Orleans and he really poured the effort and money into it, by then it was like he was trying to recover what had already been lost.
And I think that's probably a fair assessment, and he has recovered some of that, but not all of it. You know, I mean, people just in general are moving away from print, and I don't know how much they've embraced it. I mean, the thing that I hear from Baton Rouge people is that there's too much New Orleans news in the Baton Rouge Advocate now, and I think New Orleans people think there's too much Baton Rouge news in the New Orleans Advocate. And I, as a New Orleanian living in Baton Rouge, I love it. And I think, you know, people need to start thinking more regionally. I think that's one reason why the paper in both cities appeals more to like the business person who is looking at both markets when making buying decisions or investment decisions. But so many people, in both cities are still so provincial. And there's so much feudalism between these two cities. And so I think it's really the greatest thing to have this newspaper that's really bridging these gaps at the market level. But I think a lot of people, like Errol says, they want their newspaper. They want, they want the old traditional thing. They don't want change. And
I think what hurt in those early days with the manships, and I think you're right. A lot of people got it just to be getting it, but they go to the obituary page, and the obituary would be like Greenwell Springs and Krotz Springs, and not New Orleans, and so that's
a real bellwether, though.
Yeah. And so that was pretty obvious. Now all that it's not the same paper that it was back in those days. I mean, it's a far superior paper that it was. But I think those early days did hurt. And then once Georgia's got that, they pretty much needed to start rebuilding again. Yeah.
And so, of course, there was certainly some reporter shift changes, some staff changes coming from the Times-Picayune. JAQUETTA, you were at the Times-Picayune before, right? Now you're at the Advocate, and then, of course, the Baton Rouge Advocate, the Advocate in Baton Rouge, the original Advocate, they went through some staff changes,
They went through some major staff changes, and, of course, the editor and the chief operating officer are both former Times-Picayune editors. There's, it's interesting. There's still sort of like a little bit of resentment and distrust, I think, among some of the people on the Baton Rouge staff that the New Orleans staff gets paid more, gets a better deal. I mean, I've heard that from reporters, but I think there's been a lot of focus on New Orleans for obvious reasons, and of course, Georges is building a new headquarters for the New Orleans Advocate on St. Charles. It's going to be a beautiful facility. He's got a challenge. He's got a daunting road ahead of him because he's sort of going against the grain. Most newspapers are retrenching and they're going digital, and he bought a newspaper and expanded the print product. So it's going to be tough, but I think he's going to do okay with it in the short term, at least.
We should acknowledge that David started with the Picayune too. He just went to TV. He went in a different direction.
Another path altogether.
Just I wanted to clarify. Okay, the New Orleans Advocate. Then the edition in Lafayette and Baton Rouge. The Lafayette edition isn't like the New Orleans Advocate in that it's not a total newspaper in itself. Isn't it more like the Baton Rouge Advocate, or is it?
No, they consider them three separate editions of the same paper, and even for like circulation purposes, that's one reason why it's difficult to get a handle on the numbers. They consider the Advocate to be the Baton Rouge paper, with a New Orleans edition and a Lafayette edition, and that's how the Circulation Bureau measures it and considers it. I don't know what they say here in terms of the way they promote it. I mean, it has its own separate bannerhead, the New Orleans Advocate, but the one in Lafayette is the Acadiana Advocate, and the one in Baton Rouge is just the Advocate. But the core market, in terms of demographics and for sales data, is the Baton Rouge paper. And the outlying areas, or whatever terminology they use, is New Orleans and Lafayette lumped together.
Well, it's certainly probably a benefit for the news-consuming public. We have these two very strong newspapers now covering, wonderful staffs covering, great news reporters on both.
Well, and I've argued that when I've given speeches. I mean, I was actually asked to give a speech at a Rotary Club about the paper, and so many people up there said they didn't like it as much because they didn't get their Baton Rouge news. But I said, y'all, look at the alternative. You either won't have a paper or you'll have some out-of-state company owning it, and you'll be reading about California. You think it's bad reading about New Orleans?
So we need to enjoy the situation
we need
as
to
it is.
Break it down.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. It's great to have you here again.
Thank
It's
you.
been a long time, way too long. David, you wrapped up, you and your colleague, Mike Pearlstein over there at Eyewitness News, wrapped up a multi-part series called Tainted Legacy about legacy lawsuits. So tell us your last installment. What did you find?
Well, I found that there have been a lot of attempts to fix this over the years. The big thing started in 2003 when the Supreme Court determined that you could collect, if you had your property damaged decades ago with contamination by oil and gas operations, and you sued the oil company, you could collect big damage awards and not have to spend any of it on actually remediating the property and getting it up to state standards for cleanliness. And once they realized that, and there was this big influx of lawsuits, hundreds of them, the legislature got involved. Now, that was a good thing because they needed to curtail this. They needed to make sure some cleanup was happening. But the way they went about it, piecemeal, one in 2006, another one in 2009, then 2012, 2014, they just went through it, and it created other obstacles. And so what I found was that by and large you had slowdowns to clean up, and I featured this one particular woman's case, 94-year-old lady in Cameron Parish, and she won her lawsuit. She won $34 million specifically to get up to state standards, $18 million for additional damages and cleanup. And because of the changes in the law, they had to go through another process after the trial. This time it's governed by the Department of Natural Resources. They go through more arguments, the same arguments that they had in the trial in the court. Now they got to do it in front of state agents. And those state agents said, no, $4 million. What Shell says it'll cost, that's what we're going with. So now they're fighting over that. And at that point, the lady says, just put $34 million in the registry of the court. I'm not going to keep it for myself. Put it in the court registry. Whatever it takes to clean it up, that'll be used. And they said no. So now they're fighting, and it's still fighting, and that was a 2007 case, still at the Supreme Court 7 years later.
So are cases still being filed? Or news
they are
lawsuits
still
coming?
being filed, and what you see now is a transition into some of the same players are involved in coastal erosion cases. And the most famous one of that was the New Orleans Area Levee Board's lawsuit. There's question about whether they really have standing. There was an effort by the governor and the legislature and passed to eliminate that lawsuit, but there's now going to be legal fights over that. But there are also two parishes, Jefferson Parish and Plaquemines Parish, that have sued a bunch of oil companies on specific damage to coastal wetlands and land loss, and they're trying to collect damage payments to deal with coastal restoration projects. So that's going to be a fighting on the same template that we saw with the land-based drilling that we have with the legacy lawsuits.
So is that basically what your major takeaway with this whole series, is that everything largely is just involved in a fight and ultimately put on hold?
Yes, and that no matter how much they try to tinker with it and fix it, there's a lot of politics involved. We did one of the stories focused on the money involved, the money on the lobbying side, the money even on the plaintiff side, trying to get the Supreme Court justice that they wanted in there to control it on the court side. And it's just all of these different groups trying to get control of the situation, and it's a very complex thing, and that's a recipe for more holdups, more obstacles.
If an oil company wanted to lease land today from someone, what is different about the law? Are there more provisions in the law in terms of the leasing, more demands made by the law in terms of cleaning it up, or is it still the same as it's always been?
Well, the law doesn't directly affect the lease language. It affects what long-standing leases, what kind of control those have over what kind of cleanup has to happen. It essentially says that there are explicit obligations and there are implied obligations, and it tries to make it clear that if there are things that are not specifically laid out in the lease, that you have to do exactly this to restore the land, what standard prevails. And that's been what the fight has been about. Does the plan that's set out by the Department of Natural Resources that also has strong ties to the oil industry, does that prevail, or is it what the landowner wants, or something in between?
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about this. Thanks a lot, David. And go to your website and you can find a whole lot more, right?
That's right, WWL-TV.com.
Okay, thanks a lot. JAQUETTA, really kind of quick about this right now, but we now have, HANO is now local control and has a new director. Explain to us about that.
That's right. HANO was taken over by the federal government about 12 years ago. And they, over the course of 12 years, have assigned various receivers, they call them, to oversee the agency. It finally has a new executive director and a board, which is something that it has been lacking for more than a decade now. His name's Greg Fortner. He's a New Orleans native who's worked in housing in San Francisco and Miami for about 30 years and is now coming to New Orleans. He says his goal is to improve public trust in HANO. As you know, it's been a scandal-plagued for several years.
And that's why it went into federal receivership.
It would receive money from HUD and never spend it, or the books were just not easily verifiable, no way to tell where the money had gone. And his first major step this week in his first board meeting was to get the board to allow him to write new procurement rules for HANO's nonprofit, which I reported a couple weeks ago. Under David Gilmore, the former receiver, was using funds from HUD without bidding out contracts to just sort of pass them on to agencies. So he's going to write a formal...
Through the nonprofit.
Through the nonprofit, right. And so he's writing a formal procurement process for that nonprofit in the hopes of closing that hole.
Now, HANO is an independent agency, right?
Right.
How is it funded, and what is the budget? It's a pretty sizable budget.
Yeah, it's actually about $300 million, funded largely through the federal government, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that money goes to various projects, including Section 8 vouchers, but also public housing, and then HANO for a number of years operated many scattered sites. It's been shedding those recently, though.
It has its own police department.
That's right, HANO Police Department.
When you ride around town and you see sites where people will remember public housing projects used to be, and when you see what's there now, like the Magnolia area, the St. Thomas area where River Gordons is, it certainly looks better from the outside. I mean, what are you hearing? Are these things being successful, or?
Yeah, and it's difficult to tell because some of them HANO still owns and operates directly, and others are operated by outside firms. The one that the city points to often is Columbia Park, which is the former St. Bernard housing development, and it seems to be running very well. I don't have numbers on police from the police department, but it does seem like crime is down, at least within the developments themselves.
And occupancy, what's occupancy like? The occupancy rates, are they all pretty well occupied now? I mean, for a while there, in the old system, we saw that the occupancy rate was really dropping.
Yeah, and it has still been, it's mixed still, and I think that there's still so many projects to come online that it's still not fair to say that, to compare it to where it was pre-Katrina.
Where it was before. Iberville is the newest one,
That'll
right?
be the big one and the most exciting. It's part of the federal government's Choice Neighborhoods Initiative. New Orleans selected one of about 6 cities, so they'll be redeveloping about 300 blocks related to that project.
Thanks a lot, JAQUETTA. All right, it's time for us now to look ahead. Errol.
Well, one of the famous seafood destinations along the Gulf Coast has been Stinky's Fish Camp. And I can report that Stinky's is coming to New Orleans, that the man who operates it out of Lafayette will have the restaurant in the Intercontinental Hotel. It won't be known as Stinky's. They're going to upgrade it a little bit, but it's the same people and the same following. And supposedly, if it does well, he'll be going to other Intercontinentals. So Stinky's is becoming a big operation now.
All right, thanks, Errol. David?
Well, in a sign of the times of the New Orleans journalism community, I wanted to give a shout out to The Lens, the independent newsroom, for their work on The Vault, which is putting online all of these city records, contracts, salaries of employees. So they've done a great job with that, and I'm looking forward to using it.
I bet you are, David.
Sure.
Stephanie?
I think that 6th congressional district race is really going to start to heat up. We've seen some interesting stories this week about weird tweets between Edwin Edwards and Garrett Graves, and Lennar Whitney walked out of an interview with the Cook Report when they pushed her on her assertion that global warming is a hoax. So it's finally going to, I think, heat up, and you've got some characters in that one.
Some good politics to look forward to. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. JAQUETTA?
I think something that might be interesting is when the City Council gets its hands on this request from the Deutsches Haus to build a new building in Mid-City. The City Planning Commission told them to go back and redesign it because it was too Germanic looking.
And it is the Deutsches Haus.
It is the Deutsches Haus. So.
Too Germanic.
All right.
Too Germanic.
Wow.
Thanks a lot, you guys, for being here, and thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week from Informed Sources. Have a good evening.